He turned away every wealthy widow, every beautiful heiress, every powerful family in the valley, until a plain seamstress nobody noticed did the one thing no one else thought to do. Coulter Vance had built the most feared ranch on the frontier with nothing but bleeding hands and a dead man's advice. Women chased his name. Families chased his land. He wanted none of them. Then one violent dust storm shredded the only thing he actually cared about, his father's journal. And every person in town called it trash. Every person except Elena Breyer. She asked for nothing. She just picked up her needle and stayed up for 3 nights straight, stitching the broken pages back together like they were worth saving, like he was worth something. That one quiet act cracked open a secret buried inside that journal, a secret so dangerous that by morning, powerful men were already sharpening their knives. Click like now and comment with the name of the city you're viewing. I want to know how far this story has come. Stay tuned until the end, because no one can guess what happens in part 5. The summer Coulter Vance turned 38, he got 3 marriage proposals in a single week. The first came from Margaret Hollis, whose family controlled the timber contracts north of Sable Creek. She arrived at the ranch gate in a lacquered carriage with brass fixtures, dressed like she was attending a governor's dinner instead of a dusty cattle operation. She handed Coulter a folded letter written on cream paper that smelled like rose water, and she smiled the way women smile when they already know the answer is yes. He handed the letter back without opening it. "Miss Hollis," he said, I've got 300 head that need moving before Friday and a fence line that came down overnight. I don't have time for this." She stared at him like he'd spoken in a foreign language. Nobody turned down a Hollis. The second proposal came from the widow Carmichael, who sent her eldest son as a messenger because she was too proud to be refused in person. The son, a soft-handed young man named Gerald, who'd never done a hard day's work in his visible life, read from a prepared statement while Coulter was in the middle of shoeing a horse. Coulter didn't even look up. "Tell your mother I said no." Gerald folded his paper with great dignity and walked back to his horse. The horse was cleaner than most people Coulter knew. The third came from Dorothea Fenn, who at least had the nerve to come herself and say it plainly. Dorothea was handsome, sharp-tongued, and owned more acres east of the ridge than anyone but Coulter himself. She sat across from him at his kitchen table, drank his coffee without being offered any, and told him straight out that a partnership between their 2 ranches would be worth more than any other arrangement in the county. "That's business," Coulter said, "not marriage." "I'm aware of the difference," she said. "I'm suggesting both." He respected Dorothea enough to look her in the eye when he declined. She respected him enough to leave without a scene, but he caught the flicker of something in her face. Not quite anger, not quite hurt. Something colder than either. The kind of look that stores itself and waits. After she rode out, Coulter stood in the doorway of his kitchen and watched the dust from her horse settle back onto the road. The kitchen was quiet. The whole house was always quiet. He'd built it that way on purpose. The Vance Ranch. Locals just called it the Vance Place, or sometimes just Vance Land, the way people talk about something that's become part of the landscape, sat on 460 acres of valley floor at the foot of the Alcott Range. Coulter had inherited 200 acres from his father, Thomas Vance, a man who'd come west with nothing but a mule, a rifle, and a head full of opinions. The rest Coulter had bought himself, parcel by parcel, over 15 years of work that left him with crooked fingers on his left hand from a rope accident in his mid-20s and a scar along his jaw from a cattle dispute that turned uglier than it needed to. He wasn't a handsome man in the classical sense. He was lean in the way people get lean when they work hard and eat whatever's available. His face had been weathered by too many seasons and not enough shelter. He had dark eyes that most people found difficult to read, which bothered them more than they liked to admit. And he had the kind of quiet that wasn't shyness. It was something closer to patience, like a man who had learned that most conversations weren't worth the breath they required. He employed 7 ranch hands full-time and brought on seasonal help during drives. He wasn't generous with praise, but he paid fair wages and never asked a man to do something he wouldn't do himself. His hands stayed longer than most, which was its own kind of reputation. What most people in Garnet Hollow didn't understand about Coulter Vance, what they couldn't understand, because understanding it would have required more curiosity than most of them had, was that his refusals had nothing to do with arrogance. He simply had no interest in being chosen for his land. Thomas Vance had died in the spring of Coulter's 26th year, quietly and fast. The way a man dies when his heart has been working too hard for too long and finally decides it's done. He left Coulter, the land, the cattle, a debt with the Garnet Hollow Bank that took 4 years to clear, and one other thing, a journal. It wasn't much to look at. Soft leather cover, worn at the corners, the spine reinforced with a strip of darker hide that Thomas had sewn on himself when the original stitching gave out. The pages inside were written in his father's cramped, slanted hand, notes on cattle, on weather patterns, on soil conditions in different seasons, on which neighbors could be trusted and which ones smiled too wide. Practical things, mostly. But threaded through the practical things were other entries, shorter ones, written late at night by the sound of them. Observations about the land, about what it meant to build something from nothing, about the kind of man Thomas had hoped to become, and the ways he'd fallen short. Coulter had read the journal so many times that certain passages had come loose in his memory, floating up at odd moments. While riding fence, or sitting with a cup of coffee going cold, or lying awake in the early hours listening to the ranch settle around him. He didn't talk about the journal. He kept it in the top drawer of the desk in his office, wrapped in a piece of cloth that had once been part of his mother's apron, and he took it out sometimes in the evenings, not always to read, but just to hold it. It was, outside of the land itself, the only thing he had left of his father, which was why, when the dust storm hit in the last week of July, and the journal was caught in the gust that tore through the office window, he'd left cracked open, and it landed in the yard and was thrown against the fence post and came apart, spine splitting, pages tearing loose, the old leather cover cracking clean in half. Coulter stood in the middle of it all and felt something in his chest he hadn't felt in a long time. He got down on his knees in the dirt and collected every page he could find. The storm had come fast, the way the worst ones do. No particular warning, just a shift in the air around midday that tasted like copper and grit, and then the sky went the color of an old bruise and the wind picked up hard enough to rattle the shutters. By the time Coulter had gotten the horses inside and the ranch hands to shelter, the worst of it was already tearing through the valley. He'd run back to the house for a lantern and forgotten about the window. When he came into the office and saw the empty desk drawer, saw the piece of apron cloth lying twisted on the floor and the window swinging on its hinges and the papers from his desk scattered everywhere, he went still for a second that felt much longer than a second. Then he was outside and running, and the wind was pushing back against him like it had a grievance, and he was on his hands and knees in the churned-up yard picking up torn pages and shoving them inside his shirt to keep them from blowing away. He found 43 pages. The journal had held 61. Some of the missing ones turned up along the fence line, shredded beyond reading. 2 were stuck in the branches of the old cottonwood at the edge of the yard. 1 was wrapped around a fence post 300 yards down the road, and when he unwrapped it, it tore in half in his hands. He brought what was left inside and spread it on the kitchen table under the lamp and looked at it for a long time. The cover was in 2 pieces. The spine had come apart at every seam. The pages that remained were torn at the edges, some badly, and the water that had come in with the storm had blurred the ink on several of them. The sewn sections that Thomas had added himself had burst entirely. It looked like the debris left after something had been destroyed rather than the remains of something that could be saved. Harlan Briggs, his longest-serving hand, came in to check on things around supper time and found Coulter still at the table. "Bad luck," Harlan said, looking at the spread of pages. He meant it kindly. "Yeah," Coulter said. "You might be able to get a bookbinder to look at it. There's a man in Ridgecourt who does that kind of work." "Ridgecourt is 4 days' ride." Harlan was quiet for a moment. "Could try to find someone local." Coulter didn't answer. He knew what the journal looked like. He'd been sitting here long enough to understand that what was on this table was beyond what most people would consider repairable. Some of the pages couldn't be reassembled without tearing further. The binding was gone. The cover pieces didn't line up anymore where the leather had warped. "Get some sleep," Harlan said finally. "Things look different in the morning." They didn't, but Coulter appreciated the sentiment. He asked around town the next day, not because he expected much, but because he had to try. Garnet Hollow was the kind of town that had the shape of permanence without fully committing to it. 2 main streets crossing at a water trough, a general store, a blacksmith, a doctor who was also the dentist and occasionally the lawyer when required, a saloon that had burned down twice and been rebuilt both times, and a collection of smaller businesses that came and went depending on who'd arrived on the last supply wagon and who'd decided the territory wasn't for them. Most people he spoke to looked at the journal pieces he'd brought in a cloth bag and shook their heads. Tom Alcott at the general store suggested he frame the cover as a keepsake. Frank Delaney, who did leatherwork, said he could make Coulter a new cover, but the pages were beyond what he did. The schoolteacher, Mrs. Pratt, looked at the handwriting and said it was a shame, but she didn't see how the torn ones could be reattached without the right materials. Everyone was kind about it. Everyone said some version of the same thing, too far gone. He was walking back toward his horse when someone said his name. Not loudly, more like a question than a greeting. "Mr. Vance?" He turned. The woman standing in the doorway of the small shop between the millinery and the feed store was someone he'd seen before but couldn't have named with confidence. She was unremarkable in the way that certain people are unremarkable in a crowd. Average height, brown hair pinned back without fuss, a plain gray dress that had been mended at the sleeve with thread that almost but didn't quite match. She had a calm face, the kind that doesn't announce itself. Above the door behind her, a hand-painted sign read, "Breyer's Alterations and Repair." "I couldn't help overhearing," she said, "in the store, about the journal." She paused. "Could I look at it?" He almost said no out of habit. "What do you do?" he asked instead. "Alterations, mostly, but I restore things too. Fabric, leather, paper sometimes." She looked at the bag in his hand. "I've worked with old books before. Not often, but some." He handed her the bag. She took it inside without further ceremony, and he followed because there didn't seem to be a reason not to. The shop was small and smelled like beeswax and something else he couldn't identify, some chemical or solution she used for her work. Every surface was organized with a precision that was obviously practical rather than decorative. She had tools he didn't recognize arranged in a specific order on a wooden tray, and spools of thread in what appeared to be a deliberate sequence of weight and material. She laid the cloth out on her work table and opened the bag carefully and began looking at the pieces one by one, not speaking, turning each torn page to examine the damage from both sides. He stood back and watched. After several minutes, she said without looking up, "Some of these are reattachable. Not all of them, but more than you might think. The paper is heavy enough that it hasn't disintegrated at the tears." She picked up a piece of the cover. "This is the harder part. The leather's warped and the original stitching is gone." She turned it over. "But the structure is still there." "Can you fix it?" he asked. She finally looked up at him. Her eyes were brown, steady, not particularly warm, but not unfriendly either. "I can try," she said. "I won't promise you it'll look like it did. It won't, but I might be able to make it hold together again." "How long?" "Depends on what I find as I go. A few days, maybe more." "What do you charge?" She was quiet for a moment. "Let me see what's possible first." He nodded. He went back to the ranch. He tried not to think about it too much and failed. 3 days passed. On the fourth morning, a boy from town came to the ranch with a note that said only, "Come when you can, E. Breyer." He went that afternoon. She met him at the door and led him to the work table without the usual pleasantries people feel obligated to perform. The journal was there, closed, looking. He had to stop for a second when he saw it. Looking whole, not perfect. He could see where she'd worked if he looked carefully. The spine was rebuilt with new leather that was slightly lighter in color than the original, laced in a pattern he didn't recognize. The cover pieces were rejoined with a seam he could feel with his thumb but barely see. The pages, he could tell she'd reinforced the torn edges with something, a thin backing that made them stronger without obscuring the text. He opened it. His father's handwriting was there, intact, on page after page. The water damage had lightened some of the ink, but she'd treated it with something that had brought the words back to legibility. The pages she couldn't save, she'd noted on a separate sheet with the page numbers and brief descriptions of what had been written, compiled from the passages that abutted them on either side. She'd tried to give him back as much of the content as she could. He stood there reading for longer than he'd intended. "There were entries I couldn't recover," she said. She didn't apologize for it. but most of what was there before is still readable. You worked from memory? I don't know your father's words, she said, but I know how text sits on a page. I can tell from what surrounds a damaged section roughly what was there. He turned to the rebuilt spine, running his thumb along the new stitching. This lacing, what is it? Modified bookbinding stitch. I had to adapt it because the original binding method won't hold without the full signature structure. She paused. It's more secure than the original, actually. It'll take more stress. Coulter turned another page. Stopped. There was something he hadn't noticed in his first panicked inventory of the damaged journal. Entries his father had written in a smaller hand, crammed into the margins and sewn into the edges of the binding itself. He'd seen them before, but always assumed they were just overflow notes, practical things jotted into available space. He pointed to one of them. Did you read these? Some of them, she said carefully. I had to understand how the binding was constructed. Your father sewed some of the pages directly into the spine rather than using the standard signature method. It was unusual. I had to take it apart carefully to rebuild it. She paused. I stopped reading when I understood the structure. The content wasn't my business. He looked at the marginal entry his finger was resting on. His father's cramped script, the words smaller than his usual writing, pressed into the margin like he'd wanted them close to the binding, close to hidden. The Hollis claim goes no further than the second creek bend. I saw the original markers in '54 before Aldrich moved them. Anyone who looks at the survey from that year will see it. They know I saw it. That's why I need to keep this quiet. Coulter read it twice. Then he turned back a few pages and found another one he'd seen but never paid attention to. And another. And another. They weren't margin notes. They were a record. Hidden in the binding, scattered across a dozen pages, written in a hand more careful than his father's usual casual entries. His father had put them there on purpose, sewn them in, as if he'd known that anyone looking for them would have to take the journal apart to find them. Mr. Vance, Elena Breyer said. He looked up. She was watching him with that steady expression, something careful in it now. When I took the spine apart, she said slowly, the stitching your father used wasn't standard. He'd folded certain pages differently before they were bound, created pockets almost within the structure of the book. She paused. There are sections I reinforced that I didn't fully read. But what I did see, I don't think those notes were meant to be found easily. They weren't, Coulter said. His voice had gone quieter. My father put them there himself. She nodded once. The expression on her face was the expression of someone who has understood something and is waiting to see what you intend to do with the understanding. Coulter looked back down at the page. The Hollis claim goes no further than the second creek bend. He thought about Margaret Hollis arriving at his gate in her lacquered carriage. He thought about what land she stood to inherit when her father passed. He thought about Dorothea Fenn's cold look as she rode away. He thought about the Carmichael spread and the way it had expanded steadily eastward over the last decade in ways that had never quite made sense to him. He closed the journal. What do I owe you? He said. Nothing, she said. He looked at her. I told you I'd see what was possible first, she said. Consider this what was possible. Miss Breyer, you can pay me by leaving it at that. She wasn't aggressive about it. She just meant it. He stood there for a moment with the journal in his hands, feeling the weight of the rebuilt binding, the new stitching, the work she'd put into something that the rest of the town had written off as gone. He thought about what it must have taken, the hours, the precision, the willingness to sit with someone else's damaged thing and treat it like it mattered. Thank you, he said. It came out more plainly than he usually said things, and he meant it the same way. She nodded. Take care of it this time. He almost smiled. I will. He walked back out onto the main street of Garnet Hollow, with his father's journal under his arm and the sound of his own heartbeat slightly louder than usual. The afternoon was hot. A couple of men from the Alcott operation were outside the saloon, and they nodded at him, and he nodded back, and he kept walking. He didn't tell anyone what he'd found, not yet. But on the ride home, with the journal in his saddlebag, he kept thinking about those hidden entries, about a dead man's careful, quiet record of something he'd witnessed and been afraid to speak out loud. about the way his father had trusted the journal to carry the truth even when he couldn't, and about a woman in a small shop who had taken a ruined thing in her hands and, without being asked to, treated it like it was worth saving. The thing about Coulter Vance that most people got wrong was that they read his silence as coldness. It wasn't. He'd simply learned, somewhere in the long years of building the ranch mostly alone, that words spoken too quickly cost more than words held back. His father had been the same way. A man who thought before he spoke, who'd learned from experience that the frontier didn't reward carelessness in speech or anything else. Thomas Vance had come west in 1849 with his wife, May, who died of a fever in the second winter, and a set of practical skills and no illusions about what the land would ask of him. He'd broken ground, built walls, strung fence, bred cattle, made alliances where they served him, and kept his own counsel on everything else. He'd raised Coulter in the same school of hard practicality, and Coulter had graduated with honors. What Thomas had also given him, though it wasn't intentional, or maybe it was, Coulter had never been certain, was a belief that character showed itself in small moments. Not in grand statements or dramatic gestures, but in the quiet choices that nobody was watching. The way a man treated his horses when he was frustrated. The way he spoke to someone who couldn't do anything for him. Whether he kept a promise made to no one in particular. Coulter had been watching for that quality in people his whole adult life and finding it rarely. He'd found it, unexpectedly, in Elena Breyer's decision to restore a stranger's ruined book without asking for payment or advantage. He wasn't romantic about it. He was 38 years old and had spent those years being practical. But he recognized what he'd seen, and he turned it over in his mind on the ride home the way you turn a piece of evidence over when you're not yet sure what it means, but you know it means something. The next morning, Harlan knocked on the office door just before 7. "Someone went through Elena Breyer's shop last night," he said. Coulter looked up from the desk. "What do you mean, went through it?" "I mean searched it. Windows on the back were jimmied, things moved around, some of her supplies scattered." Harlan's face was careful. Word is nothing was taken, but whoever it was looked at every drawer and cabinet. Coulter was quiet for a moment. "When did this happen?" "Sometime after midnight. She found it this morning." He picked up his hat. "I'm going to town." "Coulter." Harlan said it without the usual Mr. Vance, which meant he was saying something he considered important. "People are talking already. About the journal. About you being at her shop." "Let them talk." "They're saying she's—" He stopped, chose the words. "People are wondering what her interest is, in you specifically." Coulter looked at him. "Her interest," he said, "was in the book, that's all." "I know that. I'm telling you what they're saying." "I know what they're saying." He put his hat on. "That's not the part that concerns me right now." He rode to town. "Why?" Elena Breyer was in the back of her shop, straightening the things that had been disturbed when he came in. She looked up when he entered, but didn't stop what she was doing. "You heard," she said, "this morning. Are you all right?" "Fine." She set a bottle of something back in its place on the shelf. "Nothing was taken. They were looking for something specific and didn't find it." "What were they looking for?" She turned around and looked at him with that direct, unimpressed expression. "You know what they were looking for." "The journal," he said. "Or notes about it?" "I'd imagine so." He pulled out the chair at her work table and sat down without being invited. She didn't object. "Did you tell anyone about what you found in the binding?" "No." She said it without hesitation. "It wasn't my information to share." "But you understood what it meant." She sat down on the stool on the other side of the table. "I understood that the notes mentioned specific land claims and specific families," she said, "and that your father had gone to some trouble to hide them." A pause. "Yes, I understood what it meant." "And you kept it to yourself?" "Of course." She said it like he'd asked something obvious. Coulter sat with that for a moment. Outside, the main street noise went on as usual. The ordinary sounds of a town going about its morning. It occurred to him that whatever had been set in motion the night someone searched this shop was not going to resolve quietly. He'd lived in this valley long enough to know how it worked. Information like what was in those pages threatened specific people, and specific people in this county had both the resources and the inclination to protect themselves. Miss Breyer, he said, what you told me yesterday about the pockets in the binding, the hidden entries, did you tell me everything you saw? She was quiet for a moment in a way that wasn't quite hesitation, more like she was deciding how to say the next thing. The sections I reinforced, when I was taking the structure apart, I saw more than just the entries along the margins. There are pages folded inside the signature sections that I didn't remove. I stabilized them in place. He felt something move through him. What does that mean? It means there may be more in there than what you've already found, she said. I didn't read them, but they're there. He looked down at his hands. His father, dead for 12 years, had apparently been more careful and more afraid than he'd let on. He never told me any of this, Coulter said. It came out quieter than he'd intended. Maybe he was protecting you, she said. Not as a comfort, just as a possibility. He looked at her across the work table. The morning light came through the front window and caught the dust motes in the air between them. She had a small ink stain on the side of her left hand that she hadn't bothered to clean off. I need to look at those pages, he said. I know. And if what's in them is what I think it is, then you're going to have a problem, she said. I already have a problem. He paused. So do you. She met his eyes. I was aware of that when they came through my window last night. He nodded slowly. He thought about his father's voice. Not a specific thing his father had said, but the general tone of it, the particular quality of Thomas Vance when he was telling Coulter something he considered important, flat and steady and without drama, because the facts themselves were dramatic enough and piling emotion on top of them didn't help anyone. You didn't have to tell me about the hidden sections, Coulter said. You could have left it alone. Yes, she agreed. Why didn't you? She considered the question with what appeared to be genuine seriousness. Because whoever searched this shop will search it again, she said. And because your father put those notes in that journal for a reason. He wanted someone to find them eventually. She paused. And because... She stopped. Because what? Because it seemed like the right thing to do, she said simply. I know that's not a very complicated answer. It wasn't, but Coulter had noticed over the course of 38 years that the uncomplicated answers were frequently the true ones. He picked up his hat from the table. I'm going to look at the rest of the journal tonight. If what I find is what I think I'll find, things are going to become more complicated. I know, she said again. I'm going to need to know if anyone comes here asking about you, about the journal, about anything related. She looked at him steadily. You're asking me to inform you. I'm asking you to be careful, he said. And yes, to tell me. A pause. The street sounds outside. A horse going past. All right, she said. He left. He rode back to the ranch. He took the journal from the saddlebag and carried it inside and locked the office door and sat down at the desk and began, very carefully, to look at what his father had hidden in the architecture of a book he'd thought would never need to be rebuilt. It took him most of the night. What he found, the additional folded pages, the notations sewn into the structure so deep that Elena had stabilized them rather than disturbed them, was a record his father had kept over nearly a decade. Dates, names, observations, descriptions of property markers he'd seen in locations that didn't match the registered claims, names of men who'd been present during the surveying process in the early years of the territory, amounts paid, names of officials. It was not the kind of thing a man committed to paper unless he was afraid, and afraid specifically that whatever he'd witnessed would eventually catch up with him. And at the center of it, mentioned more than any other name, written with the particular care of someone who understood the weight of the accusation, was a family whose lacquered carriage had come through his gate just a week ago. The Hollis family had not built their empire. They had stolen it, and Thomas Vance had watched it happen and spent the rest of his life trying to figure out what to do with what he'd seen. Coulter sat at his desk until the lamp burned low, his father's voice in his memory, flat and steady and without drama. Outside the window, the valley was dark and quiet and enormous, and somewhere out there under the same sky, men who'd been watching and waiting were already moving. He didn't sleep. By the time the sky started going gray at the edges, he had read every hidden page twice and understood what he was looking at and understood what it meant. Not just for him, for every rancher in the valley whose land abutted a Hollis claim, for every family that had been bought out or pressured out over the years since the territory was organized, for every acre that had changed hands under false pretenses while the paperwork said one thing and the original markers, wherever they were, said another. His father had known, and his father had been afraid, and his father had died with the secret sewn into a book, which was either the best hiding place he could find or the most painful kind of failure. Coulter wasn't sure which. He wrapped the journal back in the apron cloth and put it in the desk drawer. He locked the drawer and put the key in his shirt pocket, close enough that he'd feel it against his chest all day. Then he went outside to start the morning work, because the cattle still needed feeding, and the fence still needed checking, and the world required its practical tending regardless of what was going on inside a man's head. But he kept thinking about a woman in a small gray dress with an ink stain on her hand, who had spent 3 days rebuilding something broken and then handed it back without asking for anything in return, and in doing so had given him not just his father's journal, but his father's secret. He didn't know yet what he was going to do with it. He knew, with a certainty that had the particular weight of things you know in your chest rather than your head, that whatever came next was going to cost him. He also knew, for the first time in a long time, that it was going to be worth it. The word spread the way bad news always does in a small town. Not all at once, but in pieces, each piece slightly wrong, until by the time it had made the full circuit of Garnet Hollow, it had become something else entirely. What started as a simple fact, someone had broken into Breyer's shop, became, in the space of 2 days, a story about a seamstress who had been caught going through a wealthy man's private papers. Nobody said it that directly. They said it the way people say things they want to believe, with a raised eyebrow, a lowered voice, a careful pause that let the listener fill in the rest. Interesting timing, don't you think? Right after Coulter Vance brings her that journal? And I'm not saying she planned it, but you have to wonder what a woman like that would want with a man like him. A woman like that. Coulter heard the phrase secondhand from Harlan, who'd heard it at the feed store. He didn't say anything when Harlan told him. He just set down the coffee cup he was holding and looked out the kitchen window for a moment at nothing in particular. "Who said it?" he asked. "Couple of the Alcott hands, but it's not just them." Harlan pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, which was something he only did when he had more to say. "Gerald Carmichael was in the saloon last night telling anyone who'd listen that the woman has been asking around about your property lines." "That's not true. I know it's not true." "Did anyone say that to him?" Harlan was quiet for a second. "Not that I heard." Coulter picked up his coffee cup again. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway. "What else?" "People are saying you ought to just let the journal go. That whatever's in it isn't worth the trouble." Harlan looked at him directly. "Some of them aren't being subtle about whose interests they're speaking for. The Hollis family. Mostly, but the Carmichaels have been friendly with them for years, and there are 2 or 3 smaller operations that have bought land from Hollis on credit terms. They've got reasons to be nervous." Coulter thought about the folded pages he'd read by lamplight until nearly dawn, the names his father had written with such careful, frightened precision, the dates, the locations of original markers that would, if they still existed, contradict every major Hollis land claim in the valley. "They know what's in the journal," he said. It wasn't a question. "Someone does," Harlan said. "They might not know exactly, but they know it's something worth looking for." That was the part that had been sitting wrong with Coulter since the night of the search. Someone had moved fast, within 24 hours of Elena returning the journal, which meant either they'd had eyes on her shop the whole time, or they'd had someone close enough to Coulter that they'd known the moment he left town with the book in his saddlebag. He thought about that for a while after Harlan went back to work. Then he saddled his horse and rode to town. Elena was at her work table when he came in, working on what looked like a woman's coat that needed the lining replaced. She didn't look up immediately, which he'd already come to understand was not rudeness, but just the way she operated. But she finished the thing she was doing before she shifted her attention, and she expected the same courtesy in return. He waited. She set down the needle and looked at him. "You found more," she said. "Yes." "How bad is it?" He sat down in the chair he'd come to think of as the visitor's chair across the work table. "It depends on what you mean by bad," he said. "It's bad for several families in this valley who've been building their wealth on stolen ground for 30 years. It's bad for the officials who helped them do it." He paused. "It's not bad for the truth." She was quiet, looking at him with that measuring expression. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet. I need to understand what I have first." He leaned forward slightly. "The pages folded into the signatures, the ones you stabilized. I need to take a closer look at some of the sections near the back binding. I didn't want to force them." "Bring it here," she said. "I have the right tools. If you force those folds, you'll damage them." "I know." He hesitated. "I'm asking you to be involved in something that's already made you a target." She looked at him steadily. "Someone already came through my window," she said. "I'm already involved." That was true. He'd been telling himself otherwise, that he could somehow protect her from the consequences of what was already set in motion. And it was the kind of thinking that felt noble and was actually just wishful. She was already in it. The question was only whether she'd navigate it with information or without. "All right," he said. "I'll bring it this afternoon." She nodded and picked up her needle again. He was halfway to the door when she spoke. "Mr. Vance?" He turned. "The coat I'm repairing belongs to Dorothy Fenn," she said. It was said without particular inflection, just information being handed over. "She dropped it off this morning. While she was here, she asked me what we talked about when you came in yesterday." Coulter felt something tighten in his jaw. "What did you tell her?" "That you'd asked about the price of a repair job and decided it was outside your budget." She looked down at the coat. She seemed to believe it, or she decided to act like she did. "Which do you think it was?" Elena considered it briefly. "I think Dorothea Fenn is a woman who collects information the way some people collect debt, slowly, carefully, and always with the intention of calling it in later." She set a stitch. "She'll be back." Coulter stood in the doorway with the morning light behind him. "If she asks again—" "I'll handle it," Elena said. "I've been managing difficult women since I was 15. I don't need instruction." He almost said something else. Instead, he put his hat on and left. He brought the journal back that afternoon, as promised. She cleared the work table, and they sat on opposite sides of it, while she carefully worked the folded sections loose from the spine with a tool that looked like a very thin, slightly curved blade. She was slow and deliberate about it, and he watched her hands because there was something useful about watching someone who was genuinely competent at something. It reminded him that precision existed, that care existed, that it was possible to approach a fragile thing without destroying it. The pages came loose one section at a time. His father had been thorough. What emerged was not just notes, but documentation. Records of survey dates, names of witnesses, descriptions of physical markers at specific coordinates in the mountain terrain north of the valley. Thomas Vance had written it all out in that cramped, steady hand, and he'd done it in a way that suggested he'd thought carefully about what would be necessary to make it legible to someone who hadn't been there. Someone like his son, reading it 12 years after his death by lamplight in an office he'd built with his own hands. He knew what this was, Coulter said, not exactly to her. He knew it was dangerous, Elena said. She was examining a page that had stuck to itself at one corner. Otherwise, he wouldn't have hidden it. He was afraid to use it while he was alive. Coulter turned a page. Maybe he thought I'd find it and know what to do. Or maybe he just couldn't bring himself to destroy it, she said. Some things are too important to burn, even when you can't figure out how to use them. He looked at her across the table. Is that from experience? She didn't answer right away. She worked the stuck corner loose with the thin blade, gentle pressure at a precise angle. My mother kept letters, she said finally, from before she married my father, from a man she'd loved before. She never talked about them, but she kept them inside the lining of a traveling case she used for 30 years. A pause. After she died, I found them when I was cleaning out her things. They were the most careful letters I'd ever read, like he was trying to say exactly what he meant and was terrified of saying too much. She set down the tool. She couldn't use them. She couldn't throw them away, so she kept them where only she would know to look. The shop was quiet. Outside, the street noise continued its ordinary rhythm. "I'm sorry," Coulter said. "It was a long time ago." She handed him the loosened page. "Look at the bottom right corner." He looked. There, in a hand even smaller than his father's usual marginal notations, were 4 sets of compass bearings and distances, written out in a format he recognized from the survey notation his father had used on the property maps Coulter kept in a flat box under the desk. "Those are marker locations," he said. "I thought they might be." He read them again. North of the second ridge, east of the Alcott Creek fork, down into the valley floor following the seasonal streambed. 4 points. 4 physical locations that, if his father had recorded them accurately, would establish the original boundaries of the land before the records were altered. "These could still be there," he said. "Original survey markers. Stone, most likely, with the government notation." "If they haven't been moved," Elena said, "moving a boundary marker is a serious crime." "So is forging property records," she said. "That didn't stop anyone." He couldn't argue with that. He sat back and looked at the spread of pages on the table. His father's careful, frightened testimony spread out in the afternoon light of a seamstress shop in a town that had already started sharpening its knives over what might be inside. "I need to go find those markers," he said. "Yes," she said. "You do. It'll mean going into the mountains. North Ridge is at least 2 days." "I know where the North Ridge is." He looked at her. She was already starting to gather the loose pages into a careful stack, handling them the way she handled everything, with an attention that was almost impersonal, precise without being cold. "You can't come," he said. She looked up. "I wasn't suggesting I could. I'm telling you because while I'm gone, this town is going to talk. People are already saying things about you that aren't true, and it's going to get worse before it gets better." "I've had people say untrue things about me before," she said. "It's unpleasant. I survive it. This is different. These aren't people gossiping about an outsider. These are people with financial interests in making sure you're not believed." She held his gaze. Something in her face shifted. Not quite hardening, but settling, the way a person's face settles when they've made a decision and stopped arguing with it internally. "Then I'll be careful," she said, "and I'd ask you to be the same." "I'm always careful." "You're going to go into the mountains alone looking for evidence that several of the most powerful families in this county have been committing fraud for 30 years, she said. "I'd call that more optimistic than careful." He surprised himself by almost laughing. It came out as a short exhale, not quite a laugh, but close. "Fair point." "Take Harlan," she said, "or someone else you trust." He considered it. "I'll take Harlan." She nodded. She slid the reassembled journal across the table toward him. He reached for it, and for a moment their hands were both on the table, not quite touching, just close, her ink-stained fingers on the edge of the cloth and his on the cover of the book. "Whatever you find up there," she said, "document it. Measurements, descriptions, photograph it if you can. You'll need more than just your word." "I know." "And Coulter." She used his name for the first time, just like that, without formality. And he noticed it the way you notice a change in weather. Not because it's dramatic, but because the air is simply different. Be careful with who you trust when you come back. Not everyone in this town wants you to find what your father hid. He picked up the journal. He held it for a moment, feeling the new binding, the work she'd put into it, the weight of what was inside. "I know," he said again. "Thank you." Again. "You can thank me by making sure it mattered," she said, and turned back to Dorothea Fenn's coat. He left. He was 3 blocks down the main street when Gerald Carmichael stepped out from between 2 buildings and stopped in front of him. Gerald was not a physical threat. He was soft in the way his mother had made him soft, the way certain kinds of money make men soft. But he was blocking the road, and his expression had the particular look of a man delivering a message on behalf of someone more dangerous than himself. "Mr. Vance," he said, "my mother would like a word." "Your mother can send a letter," Coulter said, and moved to go around him. "This is about the seamstress," Gerald said. Coulter stopped. "My mother has some concerns," Gerald continued, finding his feet a little now that he had Coulter's attention, "about the nature of the relationship. People are talking. She feels it would be in everyone's interest if you simply, Gerald, Coulter said, distanced yourself from Gerald, quieter this time, which was worse. Gerald stopped. Whatever your mother's worried about, Coulter said, she can worry about it somewhere else. And if anyone connected to your family goes near that shop again, at night or any other time, I will not be going to the sheriff. He looked at Gerald steadily. I'll be coming to your mother directly. Gerald's face went through several colors. That sounds like a threat. No, Coulter said. A threat is what your people have been making for the last 2 days. What I'm doing is telling you clearly what's going to happen. He put his hat back on. Good afternoon. He walked to his horse, untied it, mounted, and rode out of Garnet Hollow without looking back. But his hands on the reins were not entirely steady, and he knew it, and he didn't pretend otherwise. He was one man with a dead man's journal and a witness list that consisted of nobody currently living. The families named in those pages had lawyers, influence, and 30 years of established ownership on their side. The markers might not be where his father said they were. They might have been removed years ago. He rode through the valley, with the mountains getting larger ahead of him, and he thought about his father's voice, that flat, steady quality, and about a woman sitting in a small shop carefully separating his inheritance from the damage the world had done to it, and about the particular kind of fear that comes not from what might happen to you, but from what might happen to someone who made the mistake of being honest near you. He thought, I should not have brought the journal to her shop. Then he thought, she would have found out anyway. She'd already found it. Then he stopped thinking about it and focused on the road, because the mountains were 2 days out, and he needed to get back before whatever was building in Garnet Hollow built itself into something he couldn't stop. Behind him, the town went on doing what small towns do when something dangerous starts moving through them, pretending everything was ordinary, right up until it wasn't anymore. They left before dawn, Coulter and Harlan, with 2 horses loaded light and the journal's compass bearings copied onto a separate sheet of paper that Coulter kept folded inside his shirt, close to the key he still carried from the desk drawer. He hadn't told Harlan everything, just enough. That the journal contained information about disputed land claims, that there might be physical markers in the North Ridge terrain that would support what his father had written, that some people in the valley wanted the journal gone and would likely act on that want while Coulter was away from the ranch. Harlan had listened to all of this without interrupting, which was one of the things Coulter valued most about him. And the Briar woman? Harlan said when Coulter finished. She stays in town. She's not involved in the ride. She's already involved, Harlan said, using almost exactly the words Elena had used, which struck Coulter as either a coincidence or evidence that both of them were clearer-eyed than he was. You want me to ask my sister to check on her? Harlan's sister Ruth ran the boarding house 2 streets over from Briar's shop. She was a broad-shouldered woman with a direct manner and no patience for nonsense, and she'd lived in Garnet Hollow long enough to know every current of opinion running through it at any given time. If she's willing, Coulter said. Harlan nodded. She'll be willing. They rode north as the sky went from black to dark blue to the particular shade of gray that comes just before color returns to the world. The valley floor gave way to broken terrain within a few hours, the grassland thinning out and the ground rising into rocky foothills. By midday, they were into the tree line, picking their way up trails that were more suggestion than path. Coulter had ridden this territory before, years ago, helping a neighboring rancher recover strayed cattle that had wandered up into the high country. He remembered it as difficult ground, loose shale on the upper slopes, seasonal streams that made the lower trails unpredictable, and a particular stretch of cliff face on the northeast approach to the second ridge that required the horses to be led rather than ridden. His father's bearing notations were precise, but precision on paper and precision on Rocky Mountain terrain were different things. The first marker location put him east of the Alcott Creek Fork by approximately 400 yards. Finding the creek fork took most of the afternoon. If these markers were set in the 50s, Harlan said, resting his horse at the top of a slope, looking out at the terrain below, they could be buried, overgrown, moved. I know. We might ride all the way up here and find nothing. I know that too. Harlan looked at him sideways. You seem remarkably calm about it. I'm not calm, Coulter said. I'm just tired of worrying about things I can't settle until I can see them. He nudged his horse forward. Come on. They found the first marker the next morning. It was exactly where his father's note said it would be. A flat-faced granite stone approximately 18 inches high, set into the ground at the edge of a dry stream bed. The government notation was carved into the face, faded but legible. A survey date, a lot number, a directional indicator. Someone had piled loose rock against the base of it, not quite enough to bury it, but enough to obscure it from anyone who wasn't specifically looking. Coulter crouched in front of it and read the notation twice. The survey date was 1854. The lot number corresponded, when he cross-referenced it with the copy he'd made from his father's notes, to a parcel that was currently registered to the Hollis family as part of their eastern range, land they claimed to have purchased in 1861 from the original settler. But the original settler's claim, according to this marker, did not extend to this location. The boundary ran a quarter-mile west of where Coulter was crouching. A quarter-mile of difference that, multiplied across the full length of the valley, represented thousands of acres. He stood up. His knees ached from the crouch. He was getting old enough that they did that now, a fact he found irritating. "Document it," he said. Harlan had brought a notebook. He wrote down the notation from the stone in full, while Coulter measured the distance from the stream bed using the cord they'd brought for the purpose. They found 2 more markers that day, each one consistent with his father's notes, each one establishing a boundary line significantly different from what the current property record showed. The 4th marker was gone. The hole where it had been pulled from the ground was still visible if you knew what to look for. A depression in the soil, roughly rectangular, with the edges broken in a way that suggested force rather than time. Someone had taken it. Not recently. The depression had weathered enough to suggest years had passed, but deliberately and with effort, because those stones were heavy. Someone knew this one mattered most, Harlan said, looking at the hole. My father marked it specifically, Coulter said. In the notes, it's the corner point, the one that establishes the northeast boundary of the original Hollis claim. He looked around at the terrain. Without this one, the other 3 don't complete the picture. Can you establish the location from the other 3? A surveyor could, with the right instruments and the notes. He paused. It's not nothing, but it's not as clean as it would be with all 4. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Someone went to a lot of trouble to take just that one. Because someone understood which one was the load-bearing stone, Coulter said. You don't need to destroy all the evidence. You just need to destroy the piece that ties it together. They stood in the mountain silence for a moment, the wind moving through the trees above them, the hole in the ground where a piece of the truth used to be. We still have 3, Harlan said finally. We have 3, Coulter agreed. They came down out of the mountains on the 3rd day, tired and saddle-sore, with Harlan's notebook full, and Coulter's copy of the bearings annotated with everything they'd found and hadn't found. Coming back down into the valley felt different than leaving it had. The valley looked the same. The grassland, the ranch rooftops, the thread of the main road running into Garnet Hollow, but Coulter looked at it with the particular altered vision of someone who has confirmed something they suspected and now has to decide what to do with the confirmation. They were 2 miles from the ranch when Harlan said, "Something's wrong." Coulter had already seen it. The smoke was wrong. Not the regular cook-fire smoke from the bunkhouse chimney, but something thicker and lower and in the wrong location. He put his heels to his horse without another word. The south fence line was burning. Not the whole thing, but a long section of it. The cedar post catching from what had clearly been a deliberate fire. The wire sagging as the post burned through. 3 of his hands were already working to contain it, beating at the grass with wet burlap to keep it from spreading to the dry summer pasture. And a 4th was hauling water from the stock tank in a way that made it clear this had been going on for a while. Coulter was off his horse before it fully stopped. It took 2 hours to get it under control. When it was done, the south line had lost 40 yards of fence and 2 sections of the cattle run that would need to be rebuilt. The cattle that had been in the south pasture had scattered. 2 of them were already gone, vanished through the gap in the wire before anyone had been able to close it. He stood in the late afternoon light, looking at the burned posts, and felt the tiredness in his body, and something older than tiredness underneath it. This was the second thing, said a hand named Doyle, who had been with the ranch for 3 years. He was a thin, weathered man who didn't talk much and was usually reliable for accuracy when he did. Yesterday morning, about 40 head went missing from the north pasture. We found the gate open, thought maybe someone left it, but then tonight, it wasn't an accident, Coulter said. No, sir. He looked at Harlan, who was standing slightly apart, reading the same situation with the same conclusion. Who came by while we were gone? Doyle thought about it. Sheriff Briggs stopped in the second day, said he was checking on things. Didn't stay long. A pause. And a man from the Hollis operation said he was looking for a stray that might have wandered onto our range. Did he find one? No, sir. But he walked the south line looking. Doyle looked at the burned posts, walked it pretty carefully. Coulter nodded. He was very tired. Get the cattle tallied in the morning, he said. All of them. I want to know the exact count of what we're missing. He went inside and washed the mountain off himself and ate something he didn't taste and sat at the desk in his office with the journal in front of him, not opening it, just resting his hand on the rebuilt cover. The campaign had started. He understood it now as a campaign rather than isolated incidents. The search of Elena's shop, the gossip about her character, Gerald Carmichael's conversation in the street, and now the fence fire and the missing cattle. These were not the actions of people panicking. They were the actions of people who had done this before and knew the sequence. First you isolate the target, then you make the cost visible, then you wait. The implication being, this is what happens when you cause trouble. Imagine what happens if you keep going. He thought about the fourth marker, the one that had been pulled from the ground years ago before his father died by someone who understood exactly which piece of the record to remove. That had been a campaign too, patient, deliberate, precise. He was dealing with people who thought in decades. He went to town the next morning. Ruth, Harlan's sister, met him at the door of the boarding house with the expression of a woman who had things to say and had been waiting to say them. She's all right, was the first thing out of her mouth, which told him the situation had been worse than all right. But you should know what's been happening. He went inside and sat at Ruth's kitchen table, which was the kind of table that had absorbed 30 years of difficult conversations and was not easily shocked. Ruth poured coffee without asking and sat across from him. 3 days ago, the Hollis woman, the eldest daughter, Cecilia, came into the shop with 2 of her friends, Ruth said. They didn't buy anything. They looked at everything, made comments about the quality of the work, and before they left, Cecilia said loudly enough for the street to hear that she'd heard the shop was under investigation for receiving stolen property. Coulter's jaw tightened. That's a lie. Of course it's a lie. But Sheriff Briggs came by that afternoon to ask questions. He was very polite about it, very formal. Ruth said the word formal the way people say words they mean as an insult. Wanted to know if Elena had any documentation for the materials she used for her restoration work, what her relationship with you was, whether she'd been paid for the journal repair. What did she say? She answered every question and offered to show him her materials inventory and her business records. Ruth wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, which she did. He found nothing because there was nothing to find. But the point wasn't to find anything. The point was for the whole town to see the sheriff walking into her shop. Coulter understood. It was the same principle as the fence fire. Visibility. Making the cost apparent to everyone watching. She's still there, Ruth said. She didn't close the shop, she didn't leave town, she didn't ask anyone to speak for her. She just went on working. Something in Ruth's expression shifted toward reluctant respect. She's either very brave or very stubborn. Probably both, Coulter said. He left Ruth's kitchen and walked down to the shop. The sign above the door was the same. The window was whole. She'd had the broken one from the original search repaired. He knocked, which he hadn't done before, and waited. She opened the door and looked at him without particular surprise. She looked tired around the eyes, which was the first time he'd noticed she was tired, which meant she'd been covering it until now. She stepped back to let him in. You found them, she said. It wasn't a question. 3 of them. The 4th was gone. He sat down in the visitor's chair. She sat across from him. He told her everything. The markers, the missing one, the fence fire, the cattle. He told her about Ruth's account of the sheriff's visit and Cecilia Hollis in the shop. He told her all of it without softening any part of it because she had earned the unvarnished version, and he thought she would be insulted by anything less. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They're trying to make it cost more than it's worth." "Yes." "For both of us." "Yes." She looked at her hands on the table. The ink stain on the left one had faded slightly since he'd first noticed it. "Are they succeeding?" she asked. He thought about the burned fence posts. He thought about the 460 acres his father had built, and he had expanded, and that he'd spent 15 years trying to make into something worth passing on. He thought about what it would mean to walk away from this, to burn the journal, as some people had quietly suggested, to let the Hollis family's version of history stand. "No," he said. She looked up at him. "But I want you to understand what we're dealing with," he said. "These people have been doing this for 30 years. They have the sheriff. They probably have the territorial land office. The families that bought from them on credit won't side against them because they can't afford to. And we have—" He stopped. "3 stones in the ground and a dead man's notebook," she said. "Yes." She didn't flinch at it. She sat with it the way she sat with most things, steadily, without drama, working through it the way she worked through a repair, looking at what was actually there rather than what she wished was there. "There's something else in the journal," she said. He looked at her. "I didn't mention it before because I wasn't certain," she said. "But when I was reconstructing the spine, there's a section in the very back, pages that were folded together and sealed with wax." She paused. "I didn't break the seal. That wasn't my place. But the wax has a mark pressed into it, an initial." "T," Coulter said. "Thomas." "Yes." He hadn't noticed it. He'd been so focused on the decoded entries and the bearing notations that he hadn't examined the back section carefully enough. He sat forward. "You think there's more in there?" "I think your father sealed something deliberately," she said, "which means he considered it separately from the rest, which means it might be different in kind, not just in degree." She met his eyes. "It might be the piece you're missing." The shop was very quiet. Outside, the afternoon was going on without them. Wagons, horses, the ordinary noise of a town that was simultaneously ordinary and not ordinary at all right now, depending on where you stood inside it. Coulter reached into his coat and set the journal on the table between them. "I need you to help me open it," he said, "without destroying whatever's inside." She looked at the journal for a moment. Then she reached for her tools. Her hands were steady. His were not, quite. He noticed that and didn't try to hide it, just rested them flat on the table while she worked and watched and tried to breathe at a regular pace while his father's last secret came loose from its wax seal in the careful hands of a woman who, 6 days ago, he hadn't known the name of. The seal broke cleanly. She unfolded the pages with the same deliberate care she brought to everything, smoothing each one flat against the table surface. He leaned forward and read. His father's handwriting looked back at him. But this was different from the notes and the bearing records. This was a formal statement, dated and signed, written in the precise language of a man who had thought about what he was saying and had written it as testimony rather than observation. Names, dates, specific transactions, the name of the government surveyor who had accepted payment to alter the original records, the amount, the witness. The witness was a man named Aldrich Fuller, who had died in 1869, but who, according to Thomas Vance's signed statement, had given his own written testimony to a land commissioner named Harwick before his death, a testimony that Thomas had personally seen and whose location he described in the last paragraph. A territorial archive, a specific box number, a specific location, evidence, already recorded, already stored, by a man trying to do the right thing before he died. Evidence that had been sitting in a government archive for 7 years, waiting for someone to know it existed. Coulter sat back in his chair. The afternoon light was coming through the front window of the shop at a low angle, the way it does in late summer when the season is starting to think about turning. It caught the dust in the air and made it visible. All those tiny particles just floating there in the ordinary light. "It's not just us," he said. Elena was reading the statement, her eyes moving carefully line by line. She finished and looked up. "Aldrich Fuller gave testimony before he died," she said. and Thomas Vance witnessed it. And it's in a government archive, which no one's gone looking for, Coulter said, because no one knew to look. He pressed his hand flat against his father's signed statement. Until now. She held his gaze across the table. Something had shifted between them in the last few minutes. The same kind of shift that happens when two people in a difficult situation stop being two people in a difficult situation separately and start being something more like a unit. He felt it without naming it. He thought she felt it too. The Hollis family, she said quietly, is going to come at you harder when they realize you went to the mountains. I know. And harder still if they find out what's in those pages. I know that too. She looked down at the statement again. Then we need to move faster than they expect, she said. It was the first time she'd said we and meant it as strategy rather than circumstance. He noticed. Who do you trust in this valley? Beyond Harlan. He thought about it. Really thought about it. Not who he liked, not who'd been friendly to him, but who, when it came down to it, could not be bought or pressured or frightened into the other camp. He came up with 4 names. That might be enough, Elena said. It'll have to be, he said. He folded his father's statement back along its original creases and placed it carefully inside the journal. He closed the cover. He left his hand on it for a moment, the way he sometimes left his hand on it in the evenings at his desk. Not quite holding it, just in contact with it, just acknowledging it was there. Then he picked it up and stood. I'll come by tomorrow morning, he said. Early. I'll be here, she said. He walked out into Garnet Hollow's main street, and the town went about its business around him, and he walked through it with his father's journal under his arm and the particular feeling of a man who has found the ground under his feet and is not planning to move off it. Whether the ground would hold was a different question. He was going to find out. The 4 names Coulter had come up with were not the 4 most powerful men in the valley. They were not the wealthiest, not the most connected, not the ones with the largest operations or the loudest voices at the monthly ranchers' meetings. What they were was the 4 men he had watched, over 15 years, make difficult decisions the honest way when the easier way was available. Pete Sandoval ran a mid-sized cattle operation on the west side of the valley and had once turned down a land offer from the Hollis family that would have doubled his acreage, citing boundary concerns he couldn't get anyone to explain to him in plain terms. He'd been quietly blocked from the better water access contracts ever since. Walt Greer was older, in his 60s, a former trapper who'd settled into sheep ranching in a way that most cattlemen found eccentric, and a few found offensive. He'd been in the territory longer than almost anyone, and had a memory for detail that Coulter had always respected. Nora Alcott, not related to the Alcott range, just an unfortunate coincidence of names, was the widow who ran the small freight operation that connected Garnet Hollow to the supply route. She knew every piece of cargo that moved through the valley and had opinions about most of it. The 4th was Doc Emmett, who was in the habit of knowing things about people because people told doctors things they didn't tell anyone else, and who had the additional quality of being incapable of being bribed because he didn't want anything anyone in this valley had to offer. Coulter sent word to all 4 the morning after he and Elena opened his father's sealed statement. He asked them to come to the ranch, quietly, without announcing it. He told them only that it was important and that he needed people he trusted. They all came. He laid it out for them at the kitchen table, so not the whole history, but the shape of it. The journal, the hidden entries, the boundary markers in the mountain, the sealed statement and what it pointed to, a territorial archive, a government box number, a dead man's testimony waiting to be retrieved. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. Walt Greer spoke first. I knew your father, he said. Thomas was not a man who invented things. No, Coulter agreed. The survey year he cites, 54. I was in this territory. Not the valley, further north, but I was here. Walt looked at his hands, which were the hands of a man who had spent 40 years working outdoors. There were stories even then about the way certain claims were being registered. Nothing specific, just the feeling that things weren't landing where they should. Pete Sandoval was looking at the copy of the bearing notations Coulter had laid out on the table. The east boundary marker you found, the one placing the Hollis claim a quarter-mile west of where their current deeds read, that quarter-mile runs directly along the creek line. The water rights, Nora said. The water rights, Pete confirmed. The Hollis family controls the main irrigation draw for the East Valley because their boundary includes the creek. If the real boundary is west of the creek, he stopped and let that sit. They never had legal claim to the water, Doc Emmett said. He said it flatly, like a diagnosis. And every operation in the East Valley that's been paying Hollis water fees for 20 years paid them for access to water that was never theirs to sell. The kitchen was very quiet. Coulter had understood this intellectually since reading the markers. Hearing it said aloud at his kitchen table by people who had lived with the consequences of it made it heavier. "What's the play?" Pete said. "We need someone to go to the Territorial Archive," Coulter said. "The statement my father sealed gives a specific box number. If Aldrich Fuller's testimony is still there, Nora said, if it's still there, it corroborates everything in this journal from an independent source. A man who witnessed the original transactions and gave formal testimony before he died." He looked around the table. "That's not just a dead rancher's notebook anymore. That's 2 independent records pointing at the same fraud." "Who goes?" Walt said. "Someone they won't expect, someone with a legitimate reason to be in the Capitol." He looked at Nora. She met his eyes and understood immediately. Her freight operation took her to the Territorial Capitol 4 times a year. She had standing business there. Her presence in a government building would not register as anything unusual. "When do you need it?" she said. "As soon as you can make it happen without raising questions about why you're going early." She thought about it. 10 days. I can move up a scheduled supply run and make it look ordinary." "That might be too long," Harlan said from where he was standing against the wall. He'd come in partway through and stayed quiet, but he'd been listening to everything. "I know," Coulter said, "but we can't move on this publicly without that corroboration. Right now we have physical evidence and a private statement from a dead man. That's not nothing, but it's not enough to put in front of the county and have it stick." He looked at Nora. 10 days. She nodded once. After they left, Coulter sat alone at the kitchen table for a while. The journal was in the desk drawer. The copy of the bearing notations was folded back into his shirt pocket. Outside, the ranch was doing its ordinary things. The sounds of animals and work, and the particular rhythm of a place that runs on daily necessity regardless of what is happening inside the house. He thought about the Hollis family, getting word that he'd come back from the mountains. He thought about how quickly they'd moved before, the fence fire within days of him leaving, and how they'd moved now that he'd confirmed what his father had recorded. They had 10 days, give or take, before Nora could return with either confirmation or nothing. 10 days during which the pressure would increase, and he had to hold still and not move too fast, and not give them a reason to escalate beyond what he could manage. He went to the shop that afternoon and told Elena what had been decided. She listened without interrupting, which had become something he appreciated about her. See, not the passive silence of someone who wasn't engaged, but the active silence of someone who was taking in information and thinking about it rather than waiting for a gap to speak. When he finished, she said, "They'll come at the shop again." "Probably." "And the ranch?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "The journal needs to not be at the ranch or here," she said. "If they decide to stop being subtle about it, I've thought about that." He had. He'd thought about it most of the ride to town. Walt Greer's place is the furthest from the main operations. He's got no connection to any of this that they'd expect. Can he keep it safe? Walt kept a territorial governor's correspondence for 8 months without losing a page or telling a soul, Coulter said. He can keep a journal. She nodded. A pause. And the copy of the bearing notations? On me. Always. She looked at him with that direct, measuring expression. The one he'd learned didn't mean she was judging him, just that she was thinking clearly, and the thinking showed on her face. "You're not going to tell me to leave town," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Would it do any good?" "No." "Then no," he said. "I'm not going to tell you to leave." Something relaxed very slightly in her expression. Not relief exactly, more like the absence of a tension she'd been carrying. "All right," she said. "Then tell me what you need me to do." What he needed her to do, as it turned out, was be the steadiest presence in the room when everything else started moving. The escalation came faster than 10 days. It came in Feb. On the 5th morning, Coulter woke to Doyle pounding on the bedroom door before sunrise. 3 of his hired hands had quit overnight. Not just quit, but gone, left notes and cleared their belongings in the dark. The notes were brief and said variations of the same thing. Can't stay on where there's trouble coming. One of them didn't leave a note at all, just an empty bunk and a space where his gear had been. Then, that same afternoon, a rider came from the bank in Garnet Hollow, with a letter informing Coulter that his outstanding credit account, a modest line he used for seasonal operational costs, was being called in at the end of the month due to a change in the bank's lending standards. Coulter read the letter twice, folded it, and put it in his pocket. "The bank," Harlan said. "Whitfield Hollis sits on the bank's lending board," Coulter said. "Has for 12 years. Harlan looked at him steadily. "What are you going to do?" "Pay it," Coulter said. "I have the reserves. It'll be tight, but I have it." He looked out at the yard where 2 remaining hands were working on the fence rebuild. "They want me stretched. They want me looking at the numbers instead of at the evidence." "It's working," Harlan said. "Not accusing, just honest." "I know it is," Coulter said. "That's the only part I'm not sure how to fix." He went to see Elena that evening. She was still in the shop when he arrived, later than her usual hours, working by lamplight on something he didn't recognize until he got closer. She was making copies. Carefully, precisely, transcribing the text from his father's sealed statement onto separate sheets in her own clear hand, creating duplicates in a format that could be separated from the original and sent in different directions if needed. He stopped in the doorway. "When did you start doing this?" "This afternoon." She didn't look up. "If they take the original, there should be copies somewhere, and copies of the copies." She finished a line and moved to the next. "I have very precise handwriting. Anyone comparing these to the original would be able to see their copies, but the content is exact." He came in and sat down. He watched her work for a moment. The lamp was steady. No wind coming through any window tonight, and it made the shop feel enclosed and separate from everything outside. "The bank called my credit line," he said. She looked up. "How bad?" "Manageable. But they're layering it." "I know they are." She set down the pen. "Coulter, I need to tell you something." He waited. "Dorothea Fenn came by today," she said. "Not to drop off work. She came in, closed the door, sat down in that chair, and told me directly that if I persuaded you to drop this, if the journal were to disappear or the matter were to be quietly settled, she would personally ensure my shop had customers again, my reputation in this town was restored, and that a certain piece of property east of here that I once mentioned having an interest in would become available at a fair price." The lamp held steady. Coulter looked at her across the work table. "She offered you a bribe." "A very specific one." Elena's voice was even. "She'd done her research. She knew about the property I'd mentioned to Mrs. Alcott 8 months ago in what I'd thought was a private conversation." "What did you tell her?" "I told her the shop would be fine without her customers. My reputation was my own business, and the property east of here wasn't worth what she was asking me to give up to get it." She picked up the pen again. "And then I asked her to leave." He sat with that for a moment. "She'll make it worse now." "Probably." She resumed copying. "She will, or she won't. Either way, my answer is the same." He thought about Dorothea Fenn's cold look at the kitchen table the morning she'd come with her proposal. He thought about how she'd ridden away and how he'd known, watching the dust from her horse, that she was the kind of person who stored things and waited. "She's not in the journal," he said. "The Fenn family isn't named." "No," Elena said, "but she'd lose her water access along with everyone else if the Hollis claims are overturned." She turned a page. "She has her own reasons for wanting this quiet." Outside, Garnet Hollow was settling into its evening rhythms. A dog barking somewhere, a door closing, the saloon starting to warm up for the night, faint voices and a scrape of a chair. "Nora should be back in 5 more days, Coulter said. 5 more days, Elena said. He nodded. He should go. He had a ranch running on reduced hands and a credit line being called, and he needed to be up before dawn to cover the work that 3 fewer men meant. He knew all of that. He stayed a little longer, watching her write. The 5 days were the longest of his adult life, which was saying something because he'd had some long ones. The missing cattle tallied at 19 head. Not enough to break him, but enough to hurt. Two more hands left, both citing vague personal reasons that meant nothing except that someone had reached them with something more persuasive than Coulter's wages. He worked the ranch with Harlan and two remaining hands, going to bed later and getting up earlier than he had since the early building years, when the operation was small enough that it was mostly him and one other man and whatever the day required. Elena kept the shop open. He stopped by when he could, which wasn't often enough. Each time she was working, the shop never seemed to be quiet, which he came to understand was a deliberate choice on her part, a refusal to be seen reduced, a physical demonstration through sustained ordinary work that she was still standing. On the 8th day, someone threw a rock through her front window. He found out from Ruth, who sent word to the ranch. He rode to town and found Elena sweeping glass from her floor with a broom and an expression that was not quite fury and not quite grief, but somewhere between them. The look of someone who has been patient a long time and is feeling the edges of it. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." She kept sweeping. "It happened around midnight. I wasn't here." He looked at the hole in the window. The rock was still on the floor, a piece of ordinary creek stone, nothing remarkable. "I'm going to talk to the sheriff." "Don't." She said it without looking up. "Briggs won't do anything, and you going to him gives them a story to tell about how you're making accusations without proof." He wanted to argue with it and couldn't because she was right. He picked up a second broom from the corner and helped her sweep instead, which was not what he'd ridden to town for, but was what was needed. She glanced at him sideways while they worked. "You're sweeping glass." "I can see that." "That's not—" She stopped. "What?" "Nothing." She looked back at the floor. He thought she almost smiled, but he wasn't certain because she was looking down. Nora arrived back on the 10th day, mid-morning, driving her freight wagon with the particular exhausted directness of someone who has been on the road too long and has something to deliver. She came straight to the Vance ranch. Coulter met her in the yard. She climbed down from the wagon, reached into her coat, and held out a packet of papers wrapped in canvas and tied with cord. "It's there," she said. "Aldrich Fuller's written testimony to Commissioner Harwick. Box 47, exactly where your father's statement said it would be." She looked at him steadily. "Coulter, the testimony is detailed. Fuller named names, listed amounts, described the entire sequence from the original survey through the record falsification. It's been sitting in that archive for 7 years. She paused. "I also found 3 other documents filed by different parties in the same period. Small claims, individual ranchers, all raising the same boundary questions and all marked unresolved and filed away." She looked at the packet in his hands. They buried everything in paperwork, but they didn't destroy it. He stood in the yard with the sun on his face and the packet in his hands and felt something release in his chest that had been held tight for 10 days. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when this is over." He called his 4 people back together that evening, and this time Elena was there too, sitting at the end of the table in a chair she'd pulled up without being offered. No one questioned it. She'd earned her place at that table 10 days ago, and the people in the room understood it without it needing to be said. He laid out what Nora had brought. He laid out what they had. The physical markers documented in Harlan's notebook, Thomas Vance's sealed statement, Fuller's testimony from the archive, the 3 corroborating filings. He laid it out piece by piece on the kitchen table, and the people around the table looked at it and understood what they were looking at. "You can't go to the sheriff," Pete said. "No," Coulter agreed. "The county judge is friendly with the Hollis family," Doc Emmett said. "Has been for years." "Yes." "Then who?" Walt said. "A public reckoning," Coulter said. "Before the county can bury it, before any judge can rule on it in private, before any of this gets filtered through people who have reasons to make it quiet." He looked around the table. "The monthly Valley Assembly is in 4 days. Every rancher in the county attends. We bring this there, in public, in front of everyone." The room was quiet. "That's a significant risk," Pete said carefully. "If it doesn't land right—" "I know the risk," Coulter said. "But the longer we wait, the more time they have to dismantle it. They've already taken 3 hands, called my credit, broken a window, and burned 40 yards of fence." He looked at the packet from the archive. "If we let them keep setting the pace, Eventually, they'll find the piece they need to make this go away. We need to move first. He looked at Elena at the end of the table. She met his eyes. She gave one short nod. All right, Pete said. Then we have 4 days to prepare. What followed was 4 days of quiet, deliberate work. Coulter wrote out a clear account of the sequence from the journal discovery to the archive retrieval, organized so that it could be followed by an ordinary rancher with no legal training. Elena made final clean copies of the key documents, her precise handwriting transferring the critical passages into legible form, cross-referenced and annotated in the margins. Nora organized the corroborating filings into a logical sequence. Doc Emmett, who turned out to have a precise legal mind that his frontier medicine practice hadn't required until now, drafted a summary of the fraudulent transactions that cited specific dates and amounts. The night before the assembly, Coulter sat in his office with the journal in front of him and the lamp burning and the house quiet around him. He opened it to one of his father's marginal entries, not the hidden ones, just an ordinary note, the kind Thomas had written throughout the years without knowing what the book would eventually carry. The land asks something of you every day. What you give it, it remembers. He closed the journal. He went to sleep. In the morning, he put on a clean shirt, which was not something he did habitually for the Valley Assembly. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. He stepped outside into the early light where Harlan was already waiting with 2 saddled horses. Ready? Harlan said. No, Coulter said honestly. He swung up into the saddle. Let's go anyway. The Valley Assembly was held in the large barn at the Greer property, which was the closest thing the county had to a neutral venue. By the time Coulter arrived, most of the county's ranching operations were represented, some by the owners themselves, some by hand sent to report back. He scanned the room as he came in and found the faces he expected. Pete and Walt already positioned near the front, Nora off to one side, Doc Emmett near the back where he preferred to stand. And across the room, tight together with the careful arrangement of people who know they share an interest, the Hollis contingent. Whitfield Hollis himself, 2 of his sons, Gerald Carmichael beside them, and behind them, Dorothea Fenn with her arms folded and her face already composed into skeptical readiness. Elena was near the door. He'd asked her to come. She'd said she would, and she was there, in the same plain gray dress she always wore, standing with her hands at her sides, watching the room the way she watched everything, with that particular attention that didn't announce itself. He walked to the center of the floor. I have something to put before this assembly, he said. Not loudly. He didn't need to be loud, because the room went quiet when he started talking. The way rooms go quiet when the person speaking has enough gravity to pull the attention in. It concerns property boundaries in this valley and records that were falsified during the original territory surveys. It concerns water rights that have been charged to operations that had prior claim to them. And it concerns a record of those facts that has been sitting in a government archive for 7 years, which I retrieved 10 days ago. The room was very quiet. Whitfield Hollis's face had gone the color of old chalk. Coulter nodded to Elena. She came forward and set the documents on the central table. The copies she'd made, the organized sequence, the careful work of 10 days laid out in plain view of the entire assembled county. Then she did something no one in the room expected. She reached into the small bag she carried and produced the journal itself, and she opened it to the page where the wax seal had been, and she carefully, precisely, removed the stitching she'd used during the original restoration to secure the signature sections. A fine thread, nearly invisible unless you knew it was there, revealing the structure of the hidden pages in a way that made the concealment method comprehensible to anyone watching. The room saw it. They understood what they were looking at. Not just the content, but the craft of it. The way Thomas Vance had hidden his testimony in the architecture of the book itself, and the way the book's restorer had uncovered it and made it legible. It was, Coulter thought, the most effective thing he could not have planned. Everything that happened after that was loud and fast and not clean, because nothing real is clean. Whitfield Hollis was on his feet immediately, his voice carrying the particular authority of a man who had spent 30 years being the loudest voice in rooms like this. He called it fabricated. He called the documents forgeries. He called Elena Breyer a manipulator who had deceived a grieving son into believing a fantasy about his father. And then one of his own sons made a mistake. The younger one, Marcus, who was 26 and had his father's temper but not his father's self-control, moved toward the table where the documents were laid out, and it was clear from the way he moved that he intended to take them. He got within arm's reach before Pete Sandoval stepped in front of him, and then two of Walt's hired men were there as well, and Marcus shoved Pete, and Pete was not a man who accepted being shoved, and what followed was 30 seconds of the kind of confrontation that a room full of ranchers can generate very quickly when the pressure has been building for the right amount of time. Nobody drew a weapon. It didn't get that far. But it was witnessed. All of it. The attempt to take the documents, the physical confrontation initiated by a Hollis, was witnessed by every person in that barn. After it settled, and Marcus Hollis was backed off to the wall looking like a man who has just handed his opponents exactly what they needed, the room was different. The people who'd come in uncertain, the ones who'd been paying water fees and had reasons to hope the situation wasn't what it appeared to be, had watched a Hollis son try to grab evidence in front of the entire county and understood what that meant. The assembly didn't rule. It wasn't a court. But what it was, by the time Coulter finished, was a room full of witnesses. And witnesses were harder to buy than paperwork. He found Elena after, outside the barn in the early afternoon light. She was standing slightly apart from the groups of people talking in low, urgent voices, looking out at the valley the way she sometimes looked at things she was trying to understand, steadily, without hurry. "You didn't tell me you were going to do that," he said, "with the stitching." "I decided this morning," she said. "It seemed like the clearest way to show them how it worked." She paused. "Was it all right?" He thought about the room going quiet when she'd pulled the thread. He thought about the way every person in the barn had understood, in that moment, not just what Thomas Vance had hidden, but how carefully he'd hidden it and what it had taken to find it. "Yes," he said, "it was exactly right." She nodded once, looking back out at the valley. "It's not over," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it's different now." They stood there for a moment in the afternoon light. The voices behind them continued, animated and overlapping, the sound of a community that has just had its picture of itself significantly rearranged and is trying to figure out what it looks like now. The valley stretched out ahead of them, wide and familiar and full of problems that were going to take a long time to untangle. But the record was public now. The witnesses existed. The archive had been opened. Thomas Vance's careful, frightened work had finally found the open air it had been waiting for. The legal process was slow and ugly, and nothing like resolution feels in the imagination. What followed the Valley Assembly was not a clean victory. It was 3 months of territorial lawyers and contested filings, and a county judge who had to be replaced by a territorial appointee because his connection to the Hollis family became impossible to overlook once the archive documents were in the public record. It was depositions and counterclaims and a period of approximately 6 weeks during which Coulter genuinely did not know which way it was going to fall, because the Hollis family had resources and experience in this particular kind of fight that he didn't, and they used both without restraint. Whitfield Hollis hired 2 lawyers from the Capitol. They were good, not honest, but good. And they filed challenges to the provenance of Thomas Vance's sealed statement, to the chain of custody of the archive documents, to the methodology used in locating the boundary markers. They argued that the missing 4th marker made the physical evidence incomplete. They argued that a dead man's testimony, however carefully preserved, could not be verified against the living parties to the original transaction because those parties were also dead. They were not wrong about any of that technically. And for a period of about 3 weeks in September, Coulter sat with the real possibility that the whole thing might come apart on procedural grounds. That the truth would lose not because it wasn't the truth, but because the people who wanted it buried had more practice at burying things. What saved it, in the end, was not dramatic. It was administrative. One of the territorial lawyers Coulter had eventually hired, a methodical woman named Frances Alt, who charged more than he was comfortable with and delivered exactly what she promised, which he came to appreciate, found a second archive box that Nora had missed on her initial visit. Box 48, filed immediately after Fuller's testimony, contained the original field survey notes from 1854, signed by the government surveyor whose name appeared in Thomas Vance's hidden entries as the man who had accepted payment to alter the records. The field notes showed the original boundaries. The registered deeds showed different boundaries. The surveyor's own hand, in his own field notes, contradicted the official record he had later filed. The discrepancy was not subtle. It was a quarter-mile of creekside land and the water rights attached to it, written twice in the same man's handwriting with two different answers. Francis Alt presented this to the territorial court in October, with the particular quiet satisfaction of someone who has found the thing that makes everything else unnecessary. The Hollis legal team spent 4 days trying to argue around it and failed. The ruling came down in November. It was not everything. The law rarely is, but it was most of it. The original boundary lines were restored. The water rights reverted to the properties they had originally served. The families who had been paying Hollis water fees for decades were entitled to restitution, the calculation of which would take another year to settle, but would eventually result in a payment that reduced the Hollis family's operational capacity significantly and permanently. The falsification of the original survey record was referred to the Territorial Attorney General's office, which would spend the better part of 2 years determining exactly who was still living and liable. Whitfield Hollis did not go to prison. He was old, and his lawyers were good, and the men most directly responsible for the original fraud were decades dead. What he lost was the water. And the water, as everyone in the East Valley understood, was the thing that had made everything else possible. Coulter heard the ruling at Francis Olt's office in the county seat. He sat in a wooden chair across from her desk and listened to her read the relevant sections and felt, when she finished, something he hadn't expected. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter than that. Something closer to the feeling of setting down a weight you've been carrying long enough that you'd forgotten it wasn't a permanent part of you. Your father's documentation was the foundation, Francis said. Without the sealed statement establishing the connection to Fuller's testimony, the archived documents would have been difficult to contextualize. The court would have had less reason to look for Box 48. He'd be relieved to know it worked, Coulter said. Francis looked at him with the precise, somewhat impersonal expression of a very competent person. Is there anything else you need from me today? No, he said. Thank you. He rode back to Garnet Hollow. He went to the shop first, before going to the ranch, because that had become the order of things without either of them deciding it. Elena was at the work table, as she almost always was. She was working on a piece of embroidery that someone had brought in for restoration, a tablecloth with a water-damaged border that needed careful rethreading. She looked up when he came in. She read his face before he said anything. It held, she said. It held. He sat down. He put his hat on the table. The water rights go back. The boundaries are restored. The restitution process starts in the new year. She set down her needle. She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her taking it in. Not performing a reaction, but actually sitting with the information the way she sat with most things, giving it the space to land properly. Thomas Vance, she said finally, softly. Not to Coulter specifically, just saying the name. Yeah, Coulter said. They sat with that for a moment, the two of them, in the small shop that smelled like beeswax and whatever solution she used, and the particular smell of old fabric being carefully handled. The lamp was lit because the November afternoon was going dark early. Outside, Garnet Hollow was doing its usual things, indifferent to the fact that the ground under it had just legally shifted. The town is going to have opinions about what comes next, Elena said. The town has always had opinions. These will be more specific. She picked up the needle again, not to sew, just to have something in her hands. About you, about me, about the fact that you spent 4 months treating a seamstress like her observations were worth something. He looked at her across the table. They were worth something. I know that, she said. I'm telling you what they'll say. She paused. Some of them already are. He'd heard it, bits of it, from Harlan, from Ruth, from the ambient noise of a small community processing a significant event. People who had thought the journal matter would end badly for Coulter and had quietly positioned themselves accordingly were now recalibrating. Some of them were generous about it, acknowledging they'd been wrong, expressing support after the fact with the slightly too loud enthusiasm of people who hope volume substitutes for timing. Others had moved directly to a new narrative, One in which Elena Breyer had manipulated the situation for personal advantage, attaching herself to the most powerful rancher in the valley through calculated helpfulness. It was the same story they'd been telling since the beginning. They'd just updated the ending to account for the outcome. "What do you want to do about it?" he asked her. She looked at him steadily. "What I've always done," she said. "Work. Keep the shop open. Let people revise their opinions on their own schedule." That's a patient approach. "I'm a patient person." A pause. "Mostly." He turned his hat over in his hands. He'd been doing this, turning the hat, looking at the brim, putting off the thing he'd ridden here intending to say, since he walked in the door. He was aware of it and couldn't quite stop. "Elena," he said. She looked up. "The ranch is going to need rebuilding, not structurally. The operation is intact. But the hands that left, the credit line, the things that got stripped down over these past months." He looked at the hat. "It's manageable. It's not comfortable, but it's manageable. And I've managed worse." "I know," she said. "What I don't have," he said, "and what I've understood I don't have for some time is—" He stopped. He was not a man who struggled to say things. He prided himself on saying what he meant without excess. This was different. He tried again. "I've been running this ranch alone for a long time. Not because I had to, because I hadn't found a reason not to." He looked at her directly. "I've found a reason." She was very still. "I'm not asking because of what you did for the journal," he said, "or because of what you did at the assembly, or the copies you made, or any specific thing. I'm asking because of how you are, how you approach things. The fact that when you found something dangerous in a stranger's book, your first thought was that it wasn't your information to share." He paused. "The fact that you swept the glass up yourself." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, someone walked past the window. A shadow, gone almost immediately. "Coulter," she said. "I know it's not a simple thing," he said. "The ranch is a working operation. It's not a comfortable life. I've got a credit line that needs paying, and a fence that still needs half its cedar posts replaced, and I won't pretend any of that is romantic." "I'm not looking for romantic," she said. "I know," he said. "That's part of why I'm asking." She was quiet for what felt like a long time. He let her be quiet. He'd learned that about her, that her silences were not uncertainty but the working out of something real, and that interrupting them produced worse results than waiting. "I came to Garnet Hollow 3 years ago because the town I was in before got too small in a specific way," she said finally. "Not geographically, just the version of me that people had decided on didn't match anymore, and there wasn't room to be a different version." She looked at her hands. "This town decided on a version of me too. The outsider, the schemer, the woman who latched onto the right man." "They were wrong," he said. "Yes," she said. "But you can't control what a town decides about you. You can only decide whether it's worth staying." He waited. "I stayed," she said, "through all of it. The sheriff, the broken window, the Hollis daughter, Dorothea Fenn offering me property to make you stop." She looked up at him. "I didn't stay for you. I stayed because leaving would have meant letting them be right about me." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to stay. You're already staying. I'm asking you to stay differently." Something shifted in her face. Not soften, that was the wrong word for it. Opened, maybe, like a door that was already unlocked being pushed instead of just tried. "As a partner," she said. Not a question, but making sure of it. "As a partner," he confirmed. "Equal stake in the decisions, equal share of the problems." He paused. "Equal share of the fence mending, which I realize is not a selling point." She almost laughed. It came out as a short exhale, the same thing he'd done in this shop months ago, when she told him he was being more optimistic than careful. He recognized it as the closest either of them got to laughing at themselves. "I need to think about it," she said. "Take whatever time you need." "Not long," she said. "I'm not someone who takes long with things once I know what I think." She picked up her needle and looked at the damaged tablecloth. "Come back tomorrow." He picked up his hat. He stood. He looked at her for a moment, at her ink-stained hand and her plain gray dress, and her precise, steady way of inhabiting the world, and felt the particular clarity that comes when you've been complicated about something for a long time and you finally see what it actually is. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow." He went back to the ranch and did the evening work and ate supper and sat at his desk for a while with the journal in front of him, not opening it, just leaving his hand on the cover. He came back the next morning, early. She opened the door before he knocked, which meant she'd heard him coming, which meant she'd been near the door. "Yes?" she said. He stood in the doorway. "Yes." "Don't make a thing of it," she said, and stepped back to let him in. He didn't make a thing of it. He came inside and they sat at the work table and talked about practical matters. What a partnership in the ranch operation would actually look like. What her skills brought to it that it currently lacked. What the arrangement meant for the shop and whether she wanted to maintain it separately or let it go. They talked about it the way two practical people talk about a practical arrangement that they both know is also something more than that, without needing to make the something more the subject of the conversation. She kept the shop. She wasn't willing to give up a business she'd built, and he didn't ask her to. They agreed she'd spend 3 days a week at the ranch during the rebuilding period and manage the shop with the remaining time, and that the arrangement would evolve as the situation required. "You'll need to hire hands," she said, "good ones this time. People who won't leave when there's pressure." "I know who I want," he said. "It'll take a few months." "Doyle stayed," she said. "He's loyal." "He is." He looked at her across the table. "You pay attention to things." "I always have," she said. "Nobody noticed before." He thought about that, about how many things she'd probably observed in the 3 years she'd been in Garnet Hollow, walking the edges of a community that had filed her under unremarkable and stopped looking, about how much a person can see when no one's watching them see it. "I noticed," he said. She met his eyes. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here." The winter settled over the valley with the particular weight of a season that's earned. Cold coming in gradually, the grassland going brown, the mountains getting their first snowcap in early December. The ranch work contracted into its winter rhythms, which were their own kind of relentless, just different in character from the summer ones. Elena came out to the ranch 3 days a week, as agreed, and turned out to have opinions about organizational systems that were, Coulter admitted to Harlan privately, better than the ones he'd been using. She reorganized the supply inventory in a way that cut his ordering errors significantly. She took one look at the bookkeeping method he'd been using for 15 years and suggested 2 changes that made the quarterly accounting take half the time. "You're going to make me feel incompetent," he said, watching her rework the ledger system at the desk in his office. "You're very competent at cattle," she said without looking up. "The paperwork is another matter. I've managed." "You've survived," she said. "There's a difference." Harlan, walking past the office doorway at that moment, wisely kept moving. The restitution process for the Valley Ranchers began in January, as the ruling had specified. It was complex and slow and required more documentation than anyone was happy about. But Frances Olt managed it with her characteristic efficiency, and by spring most of the affected operations had received at least partial settlement. Pete Sandoval used his share to finally secure the water access he'd been managing without for years. Walt Greer, who had been affected less directly but was owed something for the decades of inflated water fees his operation had paid, donated his restitution to the schoolhouse fund, which was exactly the kind of thing Walt would do. The Hollis family did not leave the valley. They couldn't. Their remaining holdings still represented significant land, even without the water rights that had made those holdings so powerful. But they contracted. Quietly, over the following year, some of the land was sold off. Whitfield Hollis aged visibly in the months following the ruling, the particular aging of a man whose authority has been publicly, permanently reduced. His sons managed what remained, and they managed it with less of the particular confidence that had characterized the Hollis operation for 30 years. Dorothea Fenn adapted, which was what Coulter had always suspected she would do. She was too practical to hold a grudge past its usefulness. She came by the ranch the following spring with a business proposal regarding shared grazing access on the South Range, and she presented it to both Coulter and Elena without batting an eye at Elena's presence at the table, which was either genuine acceptance or the performance of it, and functionally made no difference. "You're still angry," Elena said to Coulter that evening after Dorothea left. A little, he admitted. She came with a fair proposal. I know. And she treated me like a person. She's always treated people like people when it was useful, he said. Elena was quiet for a moment. True, she said, but people can become genuinely different from who they were, or they can perform being different until the performance becomes the truth. Either way, you're still getting the better behavior. He thought about that for a while. When did you get philosophical? I've always been philosophical, she said. Nobody asked before. He looked at her across the kitchen table in his house, their house now, in the practical sense that she spent enough time in it that she'd rearranged 3 things and he hadn't changed them back. The lamp was lit. The winter had finally broken, and the air coming through the cracked window smelled like thaw. Can I ask you something? He said. You can ask. The night they put the rock through your window, he said, what did you actually feel? Not what you did, what you felt. She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, scared, she said. Not of the rock, of the persistence of it. The fact that people can want something bad enough to get up in the middle of the night and throw a rock through a stranger's window. She looked at her hands. I'd grown up thinking that kind of determined meanness was unusual, that people were mostly indifferent to each other, but indifferent people don't get up at midnight. No, he said. They don't. It made me feel very alone, she said, for about an hour. And then I decided I wasn't going to feel that anymore, and I went back to sleep. She looked at him. That's the unglamorous version. I prefer unglamorous, he said. I know, she said. That's the other reason I'm here. The journal lived in the desk drawer in the office through all of it, through the winter, through the legal proceedings, through the spring work and the summer work, and the slow rebuilding of the ranch's full operation. Coulter took it out sometimes in the evenings, still, the way he always had. He read it differently now. He knew the hidden entries, had memorized most of them, understood their place in the larger sequence, but he found himself reading the ordinary ones more, the practical observations, the notes on cattle and weather and soil, the late-night entries where his father had written about the kind of man he was trying to be. There was one entry he'd somehow missed in all his years of reading and had only found after Elena restored the journal to legibility. It was in his father's smallest hand, tucked into the margin of a page about spring planting, dated 3 years before Thomas Vance died. There are people who show up in your life without advertisement. They don't arrive with claims or credentials. They just are what they are, consistently, when no one is making it worth their while. Pay attention to those people. They are rare, and they are real, and most folks walk right past them. Coulter read it standing at the desk one evening in October, the second October after everything had settled into its new shape, with Elena in the next room going over the winter supply inventory in her precise, efficient way, her voice occasionally audible as she counted something under her breath. He thought about his father writing that in the margin of a planting note at whatever hour of whatever evening. He thought about what Thomas Vance had been thinking about when he wrote it, whether it was about a specific person, a specific moment, or just the accumulated observation of a life that had taught him to pay attention to the right things. He thought about a dust storm and a ruined book, and a woman he'd never noticed who had picked up the pieces without being asked and stayed up 3 nights treating something broken like it was worth saving. He closed the journal. He went into the next room. Elena looked up from the inventory list. Her hair was pinned back the usual way, slightly escaping at one side the way it always did by the end of the day. She had a pencil behind her ear and the ink stain on her left hand that seemed to be a permanent feature at this point, varying only in shade. Done for the evening? She said. Done for the evening, he said. He sat down across from her. My father wrote something in the journal that I missed for 12 years. She set down the pencil. She waited. He told her what it said. When he finished, she was quiet. She looked out the window at the dark October yard. After a moment, she said, He sounds like he was a good man. He was a complicated man, Coulter said, who tried to be a good one. That's most people, she said. The trying is the part that counts. He nodded slowly. The lamp between them cast the same light it always did, steady, ordinary, the kind of light that makes a room feel like what it is rather than something it's performing. He looked at her in it and felt what he usually felt when he looked at her, which was the particular comfort of someone being entirely, consistently themselves. I spent a long time, he said, choosing against the wrong things. The women who wanted the land, the families who wanted the name. He paused. I was so focused on what I wasn't choosing that I didn't think much about what I was waiting for. And now? She said. He looked at her steadily. Now I know what I was waiting for, he said. And it didn't look anything like what I expected. It looked like someone in a gray dress with ink on her hand who fixed a broken thing without being asked and didn't make a performance out of it. She held his gaze. That's not a very dramatic love story, she said. No, he agreed. It isn't. No lightning, no grand speeches. No, he said. Just someone being who they were consistently, when it wasn't easy or convenient or particularly noticed. He paused. Which turns out to be the thing that's hardest to find and the easiest to overlook. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the October wind moved through the cottonwood at the edge of the yard, the same tree he'd found journal pages stuck in after the storm, the night everything started. It sounded like it always did, ordinary, steady, indifferent to significance. Coulter, she said. Yeah. I think your father would have liked me. He smiled. It happened fully, which was not something his face did often. He would have, he said. He paid attention to the right things. She picked up the pencil and went back to the inventory list, because there was still work to be done and they both knew it, and that was fine. That was, in fact, exactly the kind of life this was going to be. Work and difficulty and the occasional burned fence post and the steady, unglamorous, genuine business of two people who had chosen each other clearly and without performance, building something that would hold. The journal sat in the desk drawer in the next room. The cottonwood moved in the wind outside. The lamp burned between them, steady. Thomas Vance had spent his life trying to find the words for what he knew and the courage to do something with them. He'd hidden both inside a book and trusted that someone, eventually, would know what to do. His son had found the book, and the book had led him, by the particular crooked logic of things that matter, to the only person in the valley who had known, without being told, that it was worth saving. That was not a clean story. It was not a simple one. It had cost something. Time, cattle, burned cedar posts, 3 months of legal proceedings, and a credit line paid down to nothing. It had required a dead man's courage and a living woman's patience and a valley full of witnesses who showed up at the right moment for their own complicated reasons. But it had held. And in the end, that was the only measure that mattered. Not whether it was easy, not whether it was perfect, but whether, when the pressure came, it held. It did. They both knew it. The valley settled into its winter darkness outside the window, and inside the lamp burned and the work went on.